International news now.
Okay, before we get into the specifics of the Supreme Court ruling on tariffs, we are going to discuss how tariffs work and how President Trump has used tariffs as a central instrument to achieve his foreign policy goals. We will begin with some basic facts about tariffs, including how they tend to affect economic behavior. Now, we're going to start this section with a video clip from the Wall Street Journal on the basics of tariffs. This video is a bit dated, I'll warn you, in that it focuses on President Trump's use of tariffs during the his first term in office. However, it is a very good and effective explanation of the general dynamics of how tariffs work. And this general explanation applies to the current state of tariff policy as well. So let's roll that clip now.
Here's how tariffs work and what Trump's proposals would do. Let's start in 2018, when President Trump put tariffs on
washing machines. We're going to benefit our consumers, and we're going to create a lot of jobs.
Since then, whenever a washing machine is imported to the U.S., the company on the U.S. side doing the importing pays a tariff to the U.S. government.
Their margins are pretty low. They've got to pass that price on to consumers who ultimately pay it. That's the whole point in some sense, to reduce demand for those goods and create space for domestic producers.
After the tariffs, not only did the price of imported washing machines go up, so did the ones made in the U.S.
There's this myth out there that if we tax imports, domestic producers won't change their prices. And that's not the case. You're creating more demand for them.
So naturally, the price goes up. And it wasn't just washers. Dryers went up in price too, even though they weren't part of the tariffs.
Usually it's the case, if you buy a washer, you buy a dryer. So even though dryers weren't directly affected by the tariff, they were indirectly affected by the shift in demand.
Now, it wasn't all bad. These tariffs did
create a lot of jobs.
About 1,800, mostly from those foreign companies like Samsung and LG opening plants in the U.S. And a study found the U.S. collected $82 million annually. But because of those price increases, it cost consumers $1.5 billion more. So they basically paid $815,000 per job.
This is a very expensive job creation program. And so that's another reason why economists don't like tariffs. They're much more cost-effective, more efficient ways of increasing employment in those industries.
These weren't the only tariffs Trump created in 2018. The big ones were on
steel and aluminum.
Those were really designed to punish China for its transgressions of international trade rules.
Also for national security. They're used to make a lot of military equipment, but also everyday things like cars.
All the industries that use steel and have to pay the higher price, that squeezes their profit margins, and it also puts them at a competitive disadvantage against foreign producers of those same goods who don't have to pay those inflated costs for their inputs. And so a lot of studies have shown that you lose jobs, as many, if not more jobs, in those downstream industries as you gain in the upstream industries that are being protected by the tariffs.
Many studies on the 2018 tariffs found some pros, some cons. Manufacturing jobs, which were on the decline, didn't increase, but they did level out. The overall economy lost jobs, mostly in those downstream industries, and the costs of the tariffs were passed on to U.S. companies and consumers. So not great for the economy, but it did motivate U.S. companies to move out of China and made supply chains more resilient. But it didn't change much of China's behavior, and in many ways they became more aggressive.
Okay, so let me say a few things about this, and we're going to be talking about this clip that you just saw for the next couple segments. So we're going to have an extended discussion. Now, the first thing to know about tariffs is that a tariff is a tax that a government places on goods that cross its borders. Usually those goods are imports from other countries, so tariffs tend to be taxes on imports. So who pays this tax initially? It is not, let me emphasize, not the foreign country or the foreign company that produced the imported good. Instead, the tariff is paid by the importing customer, usually a U.S. business entity such as a wholesaler. Like all taxes, the recipient of revenue from tariffs is a government, in this case, the federal government of the United States. although the importer writes the check to the government, they usually pass on some or all of the costs of the tariff to the endpoint consumer of the product through higher prices. If the imported good is a retail product like sunglasses or toys, two things that Professor McDonald imports a lot of, then
baseball gloves and baseball bats and baseballs. Yes.
Yes, he's a baseball
and
guy.
Sunglasses. Yes.
It makes him very boring. So if they're retail products, you're distracting the students. If they're retail products, then consumers often pay more for these products at the store, right? But if the imported good is an input of some type, like steel or parts of an automobile, then businesses who use those imports to produce consumer goods pay some or all of these higher prices on inputs, right? Of course, those businesses will also pass along these higher costs to their customers further down the supply chain, which also eventually are paid by consumers. Now, sometimes importers can pressure exporters from foreign countries to accept lower costs for their goods. Now, when this occurs, frequently when the importer country is a large consumer at the global level, the country imposing tariffs can force some of the adjustment costs of tariffs on foreign countries. But this is frequently very challenging to do. And a recent tariff estimate from economists at the Federal Reserve of New York said that foreign exporters had shouldered only 10% of the total costs of the new tariffs implemented by the Trump administration when President Trump returned to the presidency in January 2025. This means that U.S. consumers and U.S. domestic producers have shouldered 90% of the costs of these new tariffs. So, tariffs are taxes that are ultimately paid by consumers. One analysis of the tariffs concluded that prior to the Supreme Court's ruling, right, the Trump tariffs in the second Trump administration would have increased federal tax revenues by $171 billion in 2026. That equates to 0.54% of GDP, which is how economists measure the size of tax increases. And that makes the Trump tariffs in his second term the largest tax hike since 1993. Now just think about that. The largest tax hike since 1993 by a Republican administration. That is a unique instance. Yes. You don't see that very often. You don't see that very often between either of the, usually administrations lower taxes, they don't raise them. When they do raise them, they don't raise them this much. So, something to think about. Now, if tariffs are taxes that generally raise prices for consumers, why do governments introduce them? Pat here will outline what tariffs are meant to accomplish. What are tariffs? What are they good for?
That's a trick question. Well, but as the clip showed, tariffs are tools that governments use to produce specific outcomes in pursuit of broader economic and political goals. As we already established, tariffs are taxes, so they raise money for the state. President Trump often touts the large flow of tariff revenue as a key benefit of his tariffs. However, increasing revenue is not the only or even the primary goal of tariffs. Instead, tariffs are meant to reshape the domestic economy by making foreign-produced goods more expensive than domestically produced goods for domestic buyers. By making imported products more expensive, tariffs are designed to accomplish several broader goals. First, they protect domestic firms by giving them a price advantage. This helps domestic producers maintain market share within the domestic economy. You can see this in the clip's discussion of tariffs on foreign-made washing machines during President Trump's first term. Tariffs on foreign firms allowed domestic makers to increase market share by giving them a price advantage. Sometimes this economic protectionism is driven by national security concerns or other strategic considerations. Thus, tariffs can protect industries that are deemed vital to the defense of the country, even though they are not economically competitive globally. Second, tariffs protect domestic jobs through the same mechanism. By making imported goods more expensive than locally produced ones, consumers and businesses are incentivized to buy from domestic firms. So higher demand supports local factories, helps those local companies stay profitable, and reduces pressure to cut wages or move production overseas. Now, third, tariffs are designed to motivate foreign firms to build factories in the United States. To avoid paying tariffs, forest companies may choose to produce their goods inside the United States. This is another way that tariffs can potentially increase jobs in the domestic economy. Now, as the clip showed, the tariff on foreign-made washing machines encouraged foreign firms to build plants in the United States and hire American workers. Motivating foreign companies to move production to the United States also increases investment in the United States, potentially providing another mechanism to increase tax revenues. Now, finally, tariffs are a tool that governments use to try and change the behavior of foreign governments. This is a large part of President Trump's strategy involving tariffs. Tariffs can provide leverage, especially when used by countries like the United States or China, which have large economies. So tariffs can be used to pressure foreign governments to change their policies. The president threatens to say, cut off access to the American consumer if a foreign government doesn't make some policy concession to him. So President Trump's tariffs on Chinese goods were designed to push China to alter its trade practices. So to recap, tariffs are a primary tool to protect domestic economies from foreign economic competition. They're designed to protect jobs, safeguard key industries, incentivize foreign investment, and provide leverage in negotiations. But of course, tariffs also have significant costs, which Rob is going to outline for you.
Okay. So the clip that you saw earlier on how tariffs work also outlines very well the costs of tariffs. The costs of tariffs start with the fact that tariffs are taxes that are ultimately paid by consumers. This harms consumers by raising prices. The logic here is straightforward. Tariffs raise prices for consumers by adding a tax to imported goods as they enter the country. Importers must pay this extra cost at the border, and research shows that much of the tariff is passed through to retail prices rather than absorbed by foreign producers, like we already said. In the case of the recent tariffs enacted by President Trump, they were so broad that they raised prices on virtually all imported products, right? One could argue that consumers could avoid the import tax that tariffs are by simply buying domestically produced alternatives. However, this is more complicated and not quite true, right? Higher prices can spread beyond imports, and this is another good point that is made clear in the clip, because domestic producers facing less competition and enjoying more demand for their products may also then raise their prices. And this process contributes then to overall inflation and reduces consumers' purchasing power. Tariffs also reduce consumer choice, another cost of tariffs. When imported goods become more expensive, some foreign firms will cut back their shipments or exit the market, the American market entirely. Retailers may stock fewer brands or models of imported goods because of the higher costs that they bear, right? And then that makes them harder to sell, so they're just not even offered, right? Eventually, what happens then is that the options for certain categories of goods become smaller for Americans, either because the importers kind of give up on the American market and don't try to sell there, or the options shrink because they're present, but they're too expensive and out of reach for a lot of consumers. Okay, so higher costs, less choice. That's the first cost. Secondly, although tariffs can protect jobs in sectors that receive protection from international competition, tariffs also can reduce jobs in downstream industries. When tariffs increase prices for materials that are inputs, like steel, aluminum, other sort of basic components, manufacturers that use these inputs face higher production costs. Many downstream firms cannot fully pass these costs on to consumers because that will make them less competitive with their other competing firms. So they respond by cutting expenses in other ways, including slowing down hiring or laying off employees. Finally, tariffs can harm the economy by triggering retaliatory tariffs or retaliation from trading partners, which directly hurts exporters, right? For example, when the United States imposed tariffs on Chinese goods during President Trump's first term, and when he did it again against China in his second term, China responded with retaliatory tariffs on U.S. goods. In this first term, the retaliatory tariffs centered on U.S. agricultural products, including soybeans and corn, pork, wheat. These tariffs made American farm exports more expensive in China, which was the largest market for many U.S. crops. And this caused buyers to switch to suppliers for these goods from other countries. As exports fell, U.S. farmers faced a lot of different problems, including lower prices, lower sales, and a collapse really for their in demand for their products.
And let me just add one thing on the discussion about inflation and general price increases. So today, the president of the New York Fed gave a speech and he said his own internal estimates are that, so right now we're running inflation rates at about 3% in the United States. The target inflation rate for monetary policy and for the Fed is about 2%. And his own
1% too high.
1% too high. His own internal estimates are that about a half to a 3/4 of that point, which is too high, is a function of tariffs. Right, and so but he did say he expects that the effect of tariffs to be transitory. In other words, the expectation is that the U.S. will get back down to 2% inflation next year. But he basically was saying that this lag or this additional rate of inflation that's too high for right now is largely a product of tariffs.
And these latest stories coming mostly from the New York Fed, right, are really confirmation of what had been a debate, because there has been a debate out there that maybe the tariffs weren't as devastating on the U.S. economy as possible. And so these sort of recent studies.
And to be fair, so he defended the economists that wrote the paper that has got, so the data that we're talking in here, and this in particular, there was a paper released a few weeks ago by the New York Fed that generated a lot of controversy. The head of the Council of Economic Advisors for the president said they thought it was horrible analysis.
Right.
And so his speech today, he defended the economists and basically said, yes, the tariffs have increased inflation. But again, he also said the expectation is that inflation will be under control next year. That, of course, depends on what happens with oil prices, but we'll talk about that in the next segment as well. So now we're going to spend a few minutes demonstrating how central tariffs are to President Trump's trade policies and overall foreign policy. The discussion is important to appreciate the significance of the Supreme Court's decision to curtail his power over tariffs. And the most direct measure of tariffs, the importance of tariffs to President Trump's economic policy, is the fact that he sharply raised the effective tariff rate in the United States to historic levels that had not been seen for nearly 100 years. Tariffs had been relatively low in the U.S. for decades, after 1945, after World War II, due to a largely bipartisan consensus in support of free trade. During President Biden's administration, U.S. tariff levels, effective tariff levels, remained stable at around 2 to 3%. When President Trump began his second term in 2025, he sharply expanded tariffs across nearly all imports. According to the Budget Lab at Yale, the average effective tariff rate rose to about 17.9% by late 2025, the highest level since 1934.
So that's an 8-fold increase, from 2 to 3% to 18%.
Yeah. President Trump is using tariffs as leverage to remake the international economy by pressuring allies and rivals to accept new trade, security, and financial terms. Advisors to President Trump have developed concrete plans One is known as the Mar-a-Lago Accord that envisions tariffs as tools to rebalance global trade, strengthen U.S. industry, and force greater burden sharing across the international system. So President Trump is using tariffs as a major policy and revenue tool as well for the U.S. Treasury. In 2025, customs duties reached about $287 billion, nearly 3 times higher than 2024, and far above levels under the Biden administration when average tariff revenues typically ranged from $80 to $100 billion. Again, this surge reflects the scale of this expanded tariff policy. Finally, it's important to note how broadly and expansively President Trump used tariffs as a tool of foreign policy. One commentator referred to the way Trump used tariffs as a lightning bolt foreign policy instrument. As we will discuss more fully in the next section, Trump claimed this particular law, the International Economic Emergency Act, he argued that that act provided him the legal authority to impose, raise, or modify tariffs rapidly, basically when he wanted, announced over Truth Social, bypassing lengthy negotiations and signaling immediate pressure on allies and rivals alike. He claimed there were no constraints from Congress or any other part of the federal government, right? And the Supreme Court disagreed, and we now turn to that Supreme Court decision now.
Okay, now we are going to move on to the big change here, and that is the Supreme Court decision that invalidated roughly 75% of the tariffs that the Trump administration established in this past year. So we're going to start this section with a clip from ABC News on that Supreme Court ruling. So let's roll that clip now.
This is an ABC News special report.
And good morning, everyone. I'm Kira Phillips. We're coming on the air because the Supreme Court has just released a major decision involving President Trump's tariff policies and whether the president exceeded his authority with sweeping reciprocal tariffs on other nations, the centerpiece of his economic agenda. Let's get right to ABC's senior Washington correspondent, Devin Dwyer, who covers the Supreme Court for us. Devin, your thoughts?
Kira, this is one of the most significant decisions on presidential power in decades. The Supreme Court, just moments ago, in a 6-3 decision authored by Chief Justice John Roberts, invalidated most of President Trump's tariffs. 70% of the tariffs he's imposed so far in his second term here have been under the law known as the International Emergency Economic Powers Act. It was written in 1977. He claimed it gave him unlimited power to tariff any country at any level for as long as he wants. And Roberts said the law simply does not give him that authority. Congress, under the Constitution, has the power to tax Americans, collect tariffs. There's no mention of tariffs in that law, and the Supreme Court said he cannot do what he's done. Kira.
All right. Devin, thank you. Let's bring in our ABC News legal analyst and former Trump administration official, Sarah Isker. Sarah Isker. So, Sarah, your thoughts on the reasoning here?
This has been a Supreme Court that has really been shrinking down executive power. We saw them do this during the Biden administration with his student loan debt forgiveness. The reasoning here is nearly identical. The idea that presidents cannot look back to old, vague statutes from Congress to expand their own power. This, as Devin said, is a huge shift in presidential authority moving forward, and probably the most important case we've seen from the Supreme Court in decades, really putting the ball in Congress's court. If presidents want to have these big policy initiatives, they will need to work with Congress moving forward.
Okay, so let's discuss a bit more in detail what this Supreme Court ruling said. The first thing to note is that most observers have called this decision a landmark case on presidential authority. This Supreme Court has a strong conservative majority with 6 conservative justices and only 3 liberal justices. Moreover, 3 of the conservative justices were appointed under President Trump. Not surprisingly, this court has been relatively friendly toward the Trump administration on many different issues. However, in this case, there was a 6-3 majority that decided against the Trump administration and its claim of expansive tariff powers. 2 of the justices appointed by President Trump, Neil Gorsuch and Amy Coney Barrett, sided with the majority against the president. The majority opinion written by Chief Justice John Roberts was quite clear. Congress has the constitutional power to levy taxes, including tariffs, not the president. So now let's break down this decision a bit more specifically. The Supreme Court here faced a narrow but consequential question. Does the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, I'm not sure if that's the right order, but IEPA, authorize a president to impose tariffs? Now, this law, which was passed in 1977, allows presidents to regulate economic transactions after declaring a national emergency involving foreign threats. But it does not explicitly give the president the power to enact tariffs. In fact, it does not even mention the word tariffs in the law. Nevertheless, President Trump used this law to impose tariffs unilaterally and expansively based on the wording in the law that said the president had the authority to, quote, regulate importation, unquote. Now, the majority opinion decided that the president did not have the power to levy tariffs based on that wording, regulate importation, and they based that decision on two key pillars. First, the one that we already sort of covered. The court ruled that Congress is given the constitutional power of taxation, and a tariff is a tax, and so Congress is given the constitutional power to enact tariffs. Therefore, it's Congress, not the president, that has the sole constitutional power to impose tariffs. The second big pillar of this decision was based on the IEPA law that is the centerpiece of this case. Congress can give its taxation power, including the power to enact tariffs, to the president under certain circumstances by passing legislation. And that's an important aspect of this decision because it means that other laws besides IEPA can continue to be used by the president to impose tariffs. However, when Congress gives the power over tariffs to the president, it must do so clearly. And that's the crux of this decision. In the case of the IEPA law, the majority in the court ruled that the language in this law was just too vague. The words regulate importation did not clearly mean the president had the power to impose tariffs.
So let's now consider the state of affairs for tariffs in the aftermath of the Supreme Court ruling. Rob just explained that the Supreme Court's ruling focused narrowly on one set of tariffs that were based on the International Economic Emergency Act, or IEPA. So only these tariffs are now illegal. First, these now invalidated tariffs included country-specific tariffs imposed to address the flow of illicit drugs, particularly fentanyl. Under these orders, imports from Canada and Mexico were subject to additional duties of up to 25% on most goods, while imports from China faced an additional 10% tariff. These measures were justified as responses to what the executive branch described as failures by those countries to curb the export of fentanyl to the United States. The actions against Canada and Mexico were also linked to concerns about cross-border migration. The second category consisted of the reciprocal Liberation Day tariffs announced in April of this year. This was an across-the-board set of tariffs that began with a baseline additional tariff of 10% on nearly all imports from almost every country, layered on top of existing tariffs. These tariffs resulted in varying levels of tariffs for different countries around the world. For example, India was assigned a country-specific reciprocal rate of approximately 25%, significantly above the global baseline, reflecting its placement among countries identified as having large trade barriers or imbalances. Latin America was another region with variable treatment. Several major exporters, including Brazil and Colombia, remained at the 10% baseline, while others were assigned elevated rates around 15% or higher, depending on negotiations and tariff schedules. These IEPA tariffs constituted a large share of the total tariffs imposed by the Trump administration. Again, nearly 75% of tariff revenue in 2025 came from IEPA tariffs that are now illegal. However, other tariffs resulting on other statutory authorities imposed by the president still remain in place. For example, tariffs based on Section 232 of the Trade Expansion Act of 1962 survived after the Supreme Court ruling. This law allows tariffs or quotas when imports are found to threaten U.S. national security. Section 232 tariffs tend to be applied to products such as steel, aluminum, auto parts, and semiconductors. Also, Section 301 of the Trade Act of 1974 survived. This law authorizes tariffs in response to unfair trade practices, such as forced technology transfer or intellectual property violations. These tariffs were mostly applied to a wide range of imports from China, imposed beginning in 2018. So, where did the Supreme Court ruling then leave tariff levels? The ruling cut the U.S. average effective tariff rate from about 16.9% to roughly 9.1%. This was a pretty substantial decrease, but still left American tariffs much higher than previous administrations. The ruling had different effects on specific countries. So countries like Brazil and China saw large reductions in tariffs. However, countries like Great Britain and Australia, which previously had lower tariff rates because they had negotiated separate deals with the Trump administration, could actually see their tariffs increase. Finally, given that nearly 75% of tariffs were deemed illegal by the Supreme Court, expected federal revenue could drop significantly. Analysts estimate that $150 to $175 billion in tariff collections may now be subject to refund claims, while future annual tariff revenue could fall by about 50% unless replaced under other statutes.
Yes. So, as one might expect, President Trump was extremely unhappy. Extremely unhappy about the Supreme Court ruling that constrained his ability to impose tariffs while declaring a large majority of the tariffs that he already enacted in the second term to be illegal. Now we're going to show a clip from the Canadian broadcast company, news company, on President Trump's reaction to the Supreme Court ruling. So let's run that clip now.
It's easy to think, okay, the Supreme Court has ruled, those are struck down. Except
the Supreme Court did not overrule tariffs. They merely overruled a particular use of IEEPA tariffs.
On this, Trump is correct.
Donald Trump had always said when this case was going to the Supreme Court, there is going to be a plan B in case they lose.
IEEPA tariffs are only a subset of all tariffs Trump's administration has imposed so far in his second term. There are others, and the dissenting opinion on the Supreme Court makes very clear those others may become very useful. And Trump has read this dissenting opinion.
Numerous other federal statutes, which is so true, authorize the president to impose tariffs and might justify most, if not all, of the tariffs issued in this case.
And just to underline the point,
the decision came, Plan B is being rolled out.
Trump criticized the majority opinion and vowed to sign a new executive order to impose a 10% global tariff.
Yes, Trump has already ordered a new 10% global tariff through a different legal avenue than IEEPA, which may wind up simply replacing the old one the Supreme Court now considers illegal.
So this global 10% tariff, the tool that Donald Trump is using, he can only impose this tariff for 150 days. There's a time limit on it. And at the end of that 150 days, Congress has to say, okay, we're going to extend this, or nah, bro, no, we're not. And in the meantime, this gives the Trump administration a whole whack of months to do investigations into different sectors to say, hey, we might want to put some tariffs on this sector over here. Oh, hey, this industry, maybe we want to do a tariff over there.
While I am sure that they did not mean to do so, the Supreme Court's decision today made a president's ability to both regulate trade and impose tariffs more powerful and more crystal clear.
Okay. So let me expand on how the Trump administration has developed a response that strives to maintain the basic contours of his tariff policies and his broad goals for remaking the international political order and the economic order. The first thing to note is that the Trump administration already had a policy response prepared in the event that he lost this Supreme Court case. It was clear during deliberations of this case that several conservative justices were skeptical of the arguments defending the government's position. Thus, the Trump administration developed a Plan B. President Trump's, he quickly announced a 10% global tariff after the ruling. In a social media post a day later, after announcing the 10% global tariff, he later raised that global tariff to 15% in a post, but then stuck with the lower rate of 10% when the tariff was enacted. So it was kind of been going up and down. We'll talk about uncertainty at the end of the segment here. So 10% global tariff. This global tariff was enacted under Section 122 of the Trade Act of 1974. Section 122 allows the president to impose a temporary, non-discriminatory import surcharge of up to 15% to address large and serious balance of payment problems. This tariff was layered on top of existing tariffs that survived the court's decision, including those under Sections 301 and 232 that we just talked about. Now, these new tariffs have some important limitations that make them less flexible and less powerful than the earlier IEEPA tariffs that were invalidated by the Supreme Court. Now, first and foremost, these tariffs are in effect only 150 days unless they are extended by Congress. And as the commentator in the clip said, the Congress might say, no, bro. That was worth showing you the clip just to see her say that, right? So, no, bro. So, most analysts, including our friend here on the clip, argue that Congress is unlikely to extend the tariffs because tariffs are relatively unpopular with voters. And this is an election year in which the slim Republican majority in the House and the Senate are vulnerable. Therefore, these tariffs face a short expiration date. Second, Section 122 tariffs can only be applied equally across the board. They are non-discriminatory, right? Equally across the board to all trading partners rather than targeted at certain countries. This seriously undermines President Trump's strategy of using tariffs as leverage to pressure specific countries to do what he wants or face higher tariffs than the rest of the world. The Trump administration's Plan B strategy, though, does not end with these temporary across-the-board 10% tariff. The Trump administration can also use other laws to impose tariffs. And so here are two examples. First, President Trump can use Section 232, which he's used in his first term, to raise tariffs when imports threaten national security. Now, this has to follow a Commerce Department investigation, but that can be arranged. As we noted earlier, Section 232 remains the basis, as I said, for all sorts of sectoral tariffs, right? On steel, aluminum, autos, etc., that survived the Supreme Court case. So he could just expand on this. That's one further strategy besides the 122 tariffs that he already announced. The second way he could go, in addition to what he's done so far, is he could use Section 301 of the Trade Act of 1974, which allows tariffs in response to unfair trading practices. This law has already also been used for tariffs against China. It could just be expanded to other countries. And this is then all to say that despite the Supreme Court striking down IEEPA tariffs, the Trump administration can retain a high tariff regime, if you will, at roughly the same levels as before, but through different laws. The big change here is that it will just be more difficult. It'll be slower. There will be more limits than before on the Trump administration. But the Trump administration and President Trump himself seems very determined to continue a high tariff policy. Now, we are going to end today's discussion with some speculation on the future, which hasn't been going very well for me. But we're going to keep trying because, the Supreme Court ruling is a consequential decision that will constrain presidential power over tariffs. At the same time, the ruling did not find that the president has no legal authority to impose tariffs. Thus, as we've shown, the Trump administration has some avenues that it could follow to maintain its aggressive use of tariffs. So, what's going to happen next? Let me start with a practical issue. The prospect for refunds on tariffs already paid by the importer is a big question. Will there be refunds on these now illegal tariffs? This is hard to say, but it's increasingly looking like, yes, there will be. The Supreme Court, in its original ruling, did not address the refund issue. They left remedies to other authorities like the U.S. Customs and Borders Agency and things like that. Most likely, refunds will be settled by future litigation and will probably take a while. However, this process has already started, and there have been thousands, literally 2,000 is what they estimated, cases brought by importers joining in this process of trying to get refunds. And a court has already ruled against the Trump administration, which tried to delay refunds by 90 days, and they said, no, you can't. And so this is going to come to a head pretty soon, I think.
And when Trump was asked about this at the initial press conference, what are you going to do? And his response was right away, I guess we'll just litigate it.
Right. He wants to delay it, of course.
He wants to delay
because that's going to further.
The other challenge here to think about, and it was interesting, there might be this, in a sense, crowd effects going on with this, because I think it was FedEx that filed the first case, and there was some question initially about whether companies were going to be deterred from litigating or trying to get a refund because they didn't want to make the Trump administration look bad. And so there's been some question about some firms might just decide, well, this is effectively a political donation. We don't want to have a ruling that could make the Trump administration look bad.
They have to get more. They have to deal with the Trump administration in the future, and so this might be too high a cost.
Yeah, but given that a lot of firms are already starting to do this, this might be less of a consideration.
Well, the other thing that I saw in trying to analyze will they or will they not, these big companies try to get refunds, is some analysts said that there's just too much money at stake. They've already paid so many millions of dollars in these tariffs that are now declared illegal, and they could get a refund, that they're going to go for it because it's too much money to let on the table just for some sort of ambiguous future interaction with the Trump administration. There was also a futures market right away that developed in which these firms would buy the claims for refunds from companies at pennies on the dollar. And so that the companies would benefit from this by getting something right now, but then these other firms that were buying these rights would potentially get an even bigger payoff over time, but they would have to go through all the litigation. So yeah, I think this is a train that's leaving the station.
There's too much money at stake, right?
Yes.
We're talking, what, $170 to $200 billion.
Right. So refunds are probably coming. That is a problem politically, I think, for the Trump administration. It's going to cut into all of the revenue that they were planning to use for something, right? And also it highlights again the costs that were incurred by the economy in these tariffs.
Yeah.
So, okay. You're next.
One of the questions would be to ask whether these companies, when they collect their hundreds of millions of dollars in tariffs, if they're going to then pass them back to the consumers.
My guess is no.
Yeah.
So consumers don't get to try to get their costs.
So another big issue is what will happen to the trade deals already negotiated. Several key trading partners, such as the European Union, Great Britain, and Japan, have already provided significant concessions to the U.S. for lower tariff rates under the threat of IEEPA tariffs. So many of these actors are reassessing the deals because of these changing tariff levels. And the EU has paused ratification of their deal, for example. And note here the strategic challenges associated with this. So President Trump is using the IEEPA tariffs. If we think about this the last 15 months, President Trump uses the IEEPA tariffs to extract concessions, whether they're economic or political concessions from another government. So this puts pressure on the other government. They cut a deal, but cutting a deal means you have to make concessions. Well, then you have to explain those concessions to your domestic audience. And so in the case of the United Kingdom, right, you make concessions to the United States, you seemingly have a better trade deal, and then now you face potentially higher tariffs on the new instrument. Now all of a sudden, how do you explain this to your domestic audience? And so this is also a challenge for other countries around the world, because then it raises questions about, do I cut deals with the Trump administration if the Trump administration is changing its obligations and not implementing what they had done in the first place? So again,
and the latest, like the latest 10% global tariff, the limits on that really come into play in these kinds of situations. When, if the targets, meaning the rest of the world, can say, well, you know, this 10% could go away in 150 days. Why would I make a deal with the Trump administration to provide a better trade relationship? We'll just wait it out, because they could bet probably pretty confidently that those tariffs are not going to get extended by the Congress in an election year. And so it really hurts the leverage that the Trump administration has moving forward on any deals too, right?
Yeah, and so, right, and let's step back to where we started here. If we think about, you know, what's been for tough bargaining situations with other countries around the world, what's generally, at least in 2025, less so in 2026, but Trump's go-to policy, it's a threat of tariffs.
Yeah.
Right?
Every time.
Right, you upset with the Colombian president about returning migrants from the United States in January and February 2025, threatened 100% tariffs, right? But that was all done, and the credibility of those threats depended on the upholding, that ultimately on the Supreme Court's upholding that he actually had this statutory authority under IEEPA. Now he doesn't have that. And so that will undermine the credibility of these threats moving forward, and it's going to change how he negotiates with other countries around the world.
Okay, so we got one more point to make here, and that is probably the biggest problem with this whole situation when it comes to tariff policy, the Supreme Court ruling, and what it does to the Trump administration's trade strategy, is that this increases uncertainty. The Trump administration, President Trump especially, is pretty comfortable with uncertainty. He likes to be unpredictable, but now the uncertainty, as he's a victim of that uncertainty, and so it hurts his bargaining leverage, but it also just hurts the overall global economy and the U.S. economy, because we don't know what the tariff level is going to be because of this changed environment. And, you know, firms aren't really very well equipped right now to know what to do.
Yeah, so let's give a couple examples of what this looks like. So on a consumer basis, right, the question is, all right, am I going to have tariffs of 10% or 40% on my shoes? So do I need to buy more shoes? I did this when the reciprocal, remember I told you this story, when the reciprocal tariffs were announced last April, and all of a sudden duties were going up 50%, Nike stock went way down, and I was like, I got to buy some shoes. And so I get on Amazon and I bought 3 pairs of shoes because I was expecting that my $80 pairs of running shoes were going to be $110 in 3 months. Okay? So consumers have to think about this. And now you have uncertainty. So how do you plan for future spending if you don't know what the costs of any goods that rely on imports is going to be 5 or 6 months from now? But it's not just
automobiles would be a big example of this, right?
And it's
new cars.
Yeah, new cars. And the other challenge here, it's not just consumers, it's also businesses, right? Businesses, they need cost certainty to make large long-term investments. And think about large long-term investments as buying up a bunch of stock from Japan or China, inventory stock. Maybe they're building a new factory. Maybe they're buying new land to build a new retail outlet. Or maybe they're thinking about hiring new workers 6 or 12 months from now. If they can't get a hold on their cost, well, generally what happens, if you don't know what your cost structure is going to be, this is going to induce caution. You're going to be much less willing to take on risk. And so the cost of this long-term uncertainty is diminished economic activity and diminished
They're going to not hire, they're not going to expand. And then if you take an even greater step back, the original goal, the mission of the tariffs was to bring manufacturing back to the United States, right? Well, that takes very long-term, very large investments, especially from foreign companies, right? Well, how are those foreign companies going to sink that much money into moving the operations, which costs millions and millions of dollars, into the United States because of tariff policy when they don't know what the tariff's going to be? It could go way down.
Yeah, right. And so let's work through the logic of this. So imagine the president is trying to leverage, say, semiconductors manufacturers in Taiwan to make a $100 million plant investment in Texas or in Arizona. The logic of that is you're going to face tariffs of 25 to 30% unless you build here in the United States, and then you have zero tariffs. But now, because you're domestically produced good, but now the risk is, well, if I don't face that tariff, then why can't I keep making my semiconductors in Taiwan?
Why spend the $100 million?
Exactly, right? If I can just rely on my manufacturing processes at home and keep jobs in Taiwan. So this is the other, this deeper battle between deeper battle over executive authority is undermining Trump's leverage to realize some of his larger long-term goals to remake the economy of the United States. And we should also just emphasize again, right? Think about this in the legality of this and the role of the Supreme Court in terms of the prior conversation that we had about executive branch authority versus legislative branch authority over the making of foreign policy. And in this case, right, the tariffs implemented an attempt by the executive branch to take more authority and reduce Congress's capacity to influence his foreign policy. In this case, a principal instrument to threaten negotiations and to coerce other states. And now the Supreme Court has stepped in and said, nope, the president can't do these things. And so we'll wait and see whether Congress steps in and does anything to try and reassert its control over tariff policy. Given that it's an election year, it'll probably be hard to do that. But think about this more broadly in terms of that conversation that we had before the midterm about the expansion of presidential authority after 9/11 and how this Supreme Court ruling is tamping that down or reducing it a little bit.
And you can't really, that is one of the big takeaways here, is that this is one of the few examples of any part of the government constraining this particular administration and its power, right? And so that's a big part of it.
And it's important to note, right, it's not Congress restraining it here, right? We don't see Congress stepping in and saying, no, you can't do this. Instead, it's the Supreme Court stepping in to check the executive branch. But I think we're out for today. Stay tuned on what we'll cover the next time. It'll depend on what happens over the next couple of weeks.
Yeah.